If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel. Sharing it with your friends and family helps spread knowledge, and when we help others grow, we grow too. Thank you so much for listening. Let's dive into the podcast. Chapter 1. Storms of the Republic, Caesar's Early World and Rise. Part 1. Born Under Shadow, the Julian Lineage and Rome's Turmoil. On a summer day in 100 BC, a baby's cry echoed through the streets of the Suburra, Rome's bustling working-class district. This child, born to Gaius Julius Caesar and Aurelia, would one day reshape the ancient world. But his birth came during one of Rome's most violent and uncertain periods. The Julian family carried noble blood that traced back centuries to the goddess Venus herself, according to their proud claims. Yet despite their ancient prestige, they lived modestly compared to Rome's wealthiest families. Caesar's father served as a minor magistrate, respectable but not powerful enough to command armies or amass great fortunes. Rome in 100 BC was a republic tearing itself apart. The city ruled vast territories across the Mediterranean, but this success brought unexpected problems. Massive wealth flowed into Rome from conquered lands, creating a dangerous gap between rich and poor. Common citizens, the plebeians, struggled to find work as cheap slave labor flooded the markets. Meanwhile, the patrician elite grew impossibly wealthy from provincial plunder and estates worked by thousands of slaves. Two political factions emerged from this tension. The Optimates, meaning the best men, represented the old aristocratic families who controlled the Senate. They wanted to preserve traditional power structures that kept them in control. The Populares, or People's Party, appealed directly to the common citizens, promising land redistribution and debt relief. These weren't organized political parties as we know them today, but loose alliances of ambitious politicians seeking power through different means. Caesar's family aligned themselves with the Populares. His aunt Julia had married Marius, the most famous general of the people's faction. Marius had saved Rome from barbarian invasions and reformed the army, but his rivalry with the aristocratic general Sulla would soon plunge the republic into civil war. Growing up in the Suburra exposed young Caesar to ordinary Romans in ways that sheltered aristocratic children never experienced. He heard their complaints about rising bread prices, their fears of unemployment, and their resentment toward the wealthy. These early experiences shaped his understanding of what common people wanted from their leaders. The boy also witnessed the Republic's machinery firsthand. Elections filled the streets with crowds, bribes, and sometimes violence. Ambitious men competed fiercely for offices that could lead to provincial commands and enormous wealth. Success in politics required not just noble birth, but also speaking skills, military reputation, and the ability to build coalitions. Caesar's family connections placed him on one side of this growing divide, but they also made him vulnerable. As tensions between Marius and Sulla escalated toward open warfare, anyone associated with either faction risked everything. The stakes of Roman politics had grown deadly, and compromise seemed impossible. The young Caesar absorbed these lessons about power, survival, and the importance of popular support. He watched how traditional institutions struggled to manage an empire built for a city-state. These formative years in a crumbling republic would teach him that Rome needed fundamental changes to survive its own success. Part 2. Surviving Sulla. Exile, loss, and formation of young Caesar. Rome burned with fear in the year 82 BC. Lucius Cornelius Sulla had returned from his eastern campaigns with battle-hardened legions and a list of enemies to eliminate. The dictator's proscription lists appeared daily on the forum walls, naming Romans marked for death. Their crime was simple association with Gaius Marius and his faction. Young Caesar, barely 18 years old, found his name whispered in dangerous conversations. His marriage to Cornelia, daughter of Marius's ally Cinna, painted a target on his back. Worse still, his uncle by marriage had been Marius himself. These family connections that once brought prestige now threatened his life. Sulla's men moved through Rome like hunters tracking prey. They seized property, murdered citizens in broad daylight, and displayed severed heads as warnings. The dictator demanded absolute submission from anyone connected to his enemies. He called Caesar to his presence and issued a brutal ultimatum: divorce Cornelia or face the consequences. Caesar's refusal shocked even his supporters. While other young nobles bent the knee and abandoned dangerous marriages, he chose love over safety. This defiance meant exile or death. His family pleaded with him to reconsider, but Caesar would not yield. His decision revealed something important about his character that would define his entire life. Friends spirited Caesar away from Rome before Sulla's soldiers could find him. He fled to the mountains of Sabine country, then farther east toward Asia. Every day brought new dangers as he evaded bounty hunters and informants. Sleep came fitfully in forest clearings and abandoned farmhouses. The young patrician learned to live like a fugitive. During these months of hiding, Caesar's worldview crystallized. He watched Rome tear itself apart while he suffered in exile for choosing principle over survival. The experience taught him that traditional Roman politics had become a deadly game where personal connections determined life or death. He began to understand that power alone provided true security. Influential friends eventually negotiated Caesar's pardon. The Vestal virgins and other powerful figures convinced Sulla to spare the young man's life. When the dictator finally agreed, he reportedly warned them that Caesar would one day destroy the Optimates. The prediction proved remarkably accurate. Caesar returned to a transformed Rome. Many of his friends lay dead, their fortunes seized by Sulla's supporters. The traditional republican institutions remained, but real power belonged to whoever commanded the most swords. This harsh lesson shaped every political calculation Caesar would make in the years ahead. The ordeal forged Caesar's legendary resilience and cunning. He learned to read political winds, to survive when others perished, and to turn apparent weakness into strength. Most importantly, he discovered that Rome's citizens would follow anyone bold enough to challenge the established order. These insights would guide him as he began rebuilding his shattered career and dreaming of the changes Rome desperately needed. Part 3. Ambition at Dawn. Return to Rome and first political triumphs. When Caesar stepped back onto Roman soil in 78 BC, the city buzzed with opportunity and danger. Sulla's death had left a power vacuum, and ambitious young men from every corner of the Republic sensed their moment had arrived. Caesar, now 22 and carrying the weight of his family's tarnished reputation, understood that rebuilding required both patience and bold action. His first move proved shrewd. Rather than rushing into the political arena empty-handed, Caesar secured his position through marriage to Cornelia, daughter of the influential Cinna. This union brought immediate benefits: financial stability, political connections, and legitimacy among the populist faction that had once supported Marius. The marriage also demonstrated Caesar's commitment to his principles, as he could have chosen a safer alliance with Sulla's supporters. Caesar's natural gifts as an orator quickly became his most powerful weapon. In the courts of Rome, where young politicians traditionally made their names, he defended cases with a combination of legal skill and theatrical flair that captivated audiences. His voice carried across the forum with clarity and passion, and his arguments revealed a sharp mind capable of finding weakness in any opponent's position. Citizens began to recognize his name, and more importantly, they began to trust him. Unlike many aristocrats who viewed the common people as mere tools, Caesar genuinely understood their struggles. He had witnessed firsthand how Sulla's reign had crushed ordinary families, seizing their property and destroying their livelihoods. When Caesar spoke about justice and reform, his words carried authentic conviction. This connection with Rome's masses would become his greatest political asset. His legal career flourished as he took on increasingly prominent cases. Caesar defended clients against charges of extortion and corruption, often challenging powerful senators who had grown rich through provincial commands. These victories established his reputation as a champion of the people, while simultaneously building networks of grateful allies throughout Roman society. Caesar's approach to politics revealed the lessons learned during his exile. He moved carefully, building coalitions rather than making enemies unnecessarily. He understood that Rome's system rewarded those who could balance competing interests while maintaining popular support. His charm won over potential rivals, his generosity secured loyalty, and his intelligence allowed him to anticipate political shifts before his competitors. By his late 20s, Caesar had transformed from a hunted exile into one of Rome's most promising young politicians. His marriage had secured his social standing, his oratory had won him fame, and his populist instincts had earned him the devotion of common citizens. The foundation was set for greater ambitions. The stage was now prepared for Caesar to test his growing influence beyond Rome's courtrooms and political meetings, where his true character would emerge through acts of daring that would capture the imagination of an entire empire. Part 4. Pirates, Oratory, and First Alliances. Caesar's rise through daring and words. The first true test of Caesar's boldness came not in Rome's marble halls, but on the choppy waters of the Aegean Sea. While traveling to Rhodes to study oratory under the famous teacher Apollonius, pirates captured the young Roman noble. These weren't common thieves, but organized criminals who controlled shipping routes and demanded hefty ransoms from wealthy captives. When the pirates demanded 20 talents of silver for his release, Caesar laughed in their faces. The sum was far too small for a man of his importance, he declared. He insisted they raise the ransom to 50 talents, nearly tripling their original demand. The pirates, amused by their captive's audacity, agreed to the higher price. During the weeks that followed, Caesar treated his imprisonment like an extended vacation. He joked with his captors, participated in their games, and even composed poems, which he recited to them. When they failed to appreciate his literary efforts, he called them barbarians to their faces. He promised them repeatedly that once freed, he would return to crucify them all. The pirates thought this was simply another of their entertaining prisoners' jokes. Caesar's servants sailed to various cities to collect the ransom money. Upon his release, Caesar immediately sailed to the nearest Roman naval base at Miletus. He convinced the commander to lend him ships and soldiers, arguing that pirates threatened all Roman commerce in the region. Within days, Caesar returned to the pirates' stronghold with a small fleet. The attack caught the criminals completely off guard. Caesar captured most of them along with their treasure, recovering not only his ransom, but considerable additional wealth. True to his promise, he ordered their crucifixion. However, showing a mercy that surprised many, he had their throats cut before the crucifixion began, sparing them the worst agony of that brutal death. This episode spread throughout the Mediterranean world like wildfire. Here was a young Roman who turned captivity into opportunity, who kept his word even to criminals, and who showed both ruthless determination and unexpected compassion. The story established Caesar's reputation for decisive action and strategic thinking far beyond Rome's borders. Back in Rome, Caesar used his growing fame to advance his oratory skills. He studied under the best teachers, practiced relentlessly, and soon became known as one of the city's most compelling speakers. His voice could move crowds to tears or rouse them to fury. Unlike many aristocrats who spoke down to common citizens, Caesar addressed them as equals, using simple language that resonated with their daily struggles. His popularity opened doors to important political alliances. Caesar carefully cultivated relationships with influential families, offering his support in exchange for theirs. He learned to read the shifting currents of Roman politics, identifying which senators held real power and which merely pretended to influence. These early alliances would prove essential as Caesar prepared for the next phase of his remarkable rise. Part 5. The First Triumvirate, Forging Power with Crassus and Pompey. Rome's traditional political machinery was breaking down, and clever men saw opportunity in the chaos. Three ambitious Romans decided to pool their resources rather than fight each other for power. This secret partnership would change everything. Marcus Licinius Crassus was the richest man in Rome. He had made his fortune through real estate deals, slave trading, and lending money at high interest rates. When buildings caught fire in Rome, Crassus would show up with his private fire brigade and buy the burning property at bargain prices before putting out the flames. His wealth gave him immense influence, but money alone could not win him the highest offices or military glory he craved. Pompey the Great had earned his reputation as Rome's most successful general. He had conquered vast territories in the east, brought enormous wealth back to Rome, and celebrated magnificent triumphs. His soldiers adored him, and his military victories made him a hero to the people. Yet the Senate viewed him with suspicion, blocking many of his requests and refusing to approve land grants for his veteran soldiers. Caesar possessed neither Crassus's wealth nor Pompey's military fame, But he had something equally valuable: the trust and love of Rome's common citizens. His speeches stirred crowds, his generosity was legendary, and his political instincts were razor-sharp. He understood that real power in Rome now came from the streets, as much as from the Senate house. The three men met in secret, probably at Caesar's house, sometime around 60 BC. The arrangement they struck was simple, but revolutionary. Crassus would provide the money needed for Caesar's political campaigns and public works projects. Pompey would use his veterans and popular support to back Caesar's rise to consul. In return, Caesar would use his position as consul to push through legislation that would benefit both his partners. The alliance worked brilliantly at first. Caesar won the consulship for 59 BC, despite fierce opposition from conservative senators. Once in office, he rammed through laws giving Pompey's soldiers the land they had been promised and confirming Pompey's arrangements in the conquered territories. Crassus received lucrative tax farming contracts and favorable business deals. Caesar secured for himself the governorship of Gaul, where he could build his own military reputation and fortune. The three men sealed their bargain with a marriage alliance. Caesar gave his daughter Julia in marriage to Pompey, despite the significant age difference. This personal bond seemed to guarantee their political partnership would endure. Yet beneath the surface cooperation, tensions simmered. Each man harbored ambitions that ultimately conflicted with the others. Crassus resented Pompey's military glory and Caesar's growing popularity. Pompey grew uncomfortable with Caesar's rising star and increasing wealth from his Gallic conquests. Caesar, meanwhile, was building the most loyal and experienced army Rome had ever seen. The triumvirate gave Caesar the launching pad he needed. With Crassus's gold and Pompey's backing, he had secured the consulship and the Gallic command. Now he would march north to prove himself as a general and return with the military credentials to match his political genius. The partnership that had elevated all three men was already sowing the seeds of its own destruction. Chapter 2: The Forge of Conquest, Gaul, Glory, and Collision Course. The outbreak in Gaul. Caesar launches his campaign. The year 58 BC found Julius Caesar standing at a crossroads that would define both his destiny and Rome's future. As the newly appointed consul, he possessed the legal authority to command legions, but his political position remained precarious. His alliance with Pompey and Crassus had secured him the consulship, yet his enemies in the Senate watched his every move with growing suspicion. Caesar needed something more than political maneuvering. He needed military glory and the wealth that came with conquest. His gaze turned northward to Gaul, a land of fierce tribes and untapped riches that stretched from the Alps to the Atlantic Ocean. The situation in Gaul presented the perfect opportunity. The Helvetii, a powerful Celtic tribe from what is now Switzerland, had grown restless in their mountain homeland. Their population had swelled beyond what their territory could support, and they planned a massive migration westward through Roman-controlled territory. This movement would disrupt trade routes and threaten Roman allies in southern Gaul. Caesar saw more than a diplomatic problem. He recognized a golden chance to position himself as Rome's protector while building the military reputation he desperately needed. The Senate's authorization to defend Roman interests gave him the legal foundation for what would become 8 years of conquest. The Helvetii migration began with nearly 400,000 people, including warriors, families, and their possessions loaded onto wagons. When they requested passage through Roman territory, Caesar refused. He had already decided this would be his first test as a military commander. Moving swiftly, Caesar assembled 4 legions and marched to intercept the migrating tribe. The Romans built fortifications along the Rhone River, forcing the Helvetii to take a longer route through hostile territory. This delay allowed Caesar to gather additional forces and prepare for the confrontation he knew must come. The first major battle erupted near the town of Bibracte. Caesar deployed his legions with calculated precision, using the terrain to his advantage. His soldiers fought with the discipline that made Roman armies feared throughout the Mediterranean world. The Helvetii, despite their courage and numbers, could not match the organized fury of Caesar's legions. Victory came at a terrible cost for the Helvetii. Thousands lay dead on the battlefield, and the survivors faced a grim choice: return to their homeland, or submit to Roman authority. Caesar chose mercy, allowing them to return, but his message was clear. Rome's northern frontier would not be crossed without consequence. This triumph sent shockwaves through Gaul. Other tribes began to reassess their relationship with Rome, while Caesar's name became known in every village from the Rhine to the Seine. He had announced his arrival as a force that would reshape the ancient world. Part 2. Triumph over tribes, the battles that expanded Rome's west. The taste of victory over the Helvetii was sweet, but Caesar knew that one battle did not make a conquest. Word of Rome's strength spread through the forests and settlements of Gaul like wildfire, and the tribal chieftains watched with growing alarm. Some sought to appease this new Roman threat, while others began to sharpen their swords. The Belgae Confederation presented the next challenge. These northern tribes had watched Caesar's initial campaign with careful eyes, and they did not like what they saw. Unlike the desperate Helvetii, the Belgae chose to strike first. They assembled a massive coalition, bringing together warriors from dozens of tribes who had never fought side by side before. Their plan was simple: crush Caesar's legions before Rome could send reinforcements. Caesar faced a problem that would have broken lesser commanders. His forces were outnumbered, operating in hostile territory hundreds of miles from home. Supply lines stretched thin across dangerous ground, and winter was approaching. The smart move would have been to retreat to safer Roman territory and wait for spring. Instead, Caesar chose to attack. The campaign that followed revealed the full extent of Caesar's military genius. He moved his legions with lightning speed, striking isolated Belgae settlements before the Confederation could fully mobilize. When the tribes finally gathered their massive army, Caesar refused to meet them in the pitched battle they expected. Instead, he used the terrain to his advantage, forcing the Belgae to fight on ground of his choosing. At the Sabus River, Caesar's tactical brilliance nearly cost him everything. The Belgae caught his forces divided, crossing the water in separate groups. For a terrifying moment, it seemed the legions might be destroyed piecemeal. But Caesar's years of training his soldiers paid off. Even caught off guard, the legions maintained their discipline. Caesar himself grabbed a shield and rushed to the most dangerous point in the battle, rallying his men through personal example. The sight of their general fighting alongside common soldiers electrified the legions. They pushed back against overwhelming odds, turning near disaster into crushing victory. The Belgian Confederation shattered, its constituent tribes fleeing to their strongholds or surrendering outright. Each victory brought new challenges and new opportunities. Caesar's reputation grew with every campaign, but so did the complexity of ruling his expanding territory. He had to balance Roman law with local customs, manage supply lines that stretched across hundreds of miles, and keep his soldiers loyal while facing constant danger. The logistics alone would have defeated most commanders. Caesar's quartermasters worked miracles, establishing supply depots and maintaining equipment for legions operating far from Rome. His engineering corps built roads and bridges at breathtaking speed, allowing rapid troop movements that consistently surprised enemy forces. These conquests transformed more than just maps. Caesar's veterans returned to Rome with stories of their generals' brilliance and bravery. His name became synonymous with victory, and his political stock soared. But with each triumph, the gap between Caesar and his rivals in Rome grew wider, setting the stage for conflicts that would dwarf even his Gallic campaigns. Part 3. Britain and Beyond. Crossing Seas and Proving Roman Might. The victories across Gaul had made Caesar the most feared general of his generation, but his ambitions stretched far beyond conquered territories. In 55 BC, Caesar made a decision that stunned both his enemies and allies in Rome. He would cross the treacherous waters of the English Channel and invade Britain. No Roman had ever dared such a feat. The very idea seemed impossible to many, for Britain lay across dangerous seas, shrouded in mist and mystery. Caesar understood the power of doing what others deemed impossible. Britain represented more than military conquest. It symbolized Roman might extending to the very edges of the known world. The island's fierce warriors and strange customs fascinated Romans, who viewed it as a land of barbarians and ancient magic. By conquering it, Caesar would achieve something that would echo through history. The first expedition faced immediate challenges. Caesar's ships struggled against fierce tides and unpredictable weather. When his legions finally reached the British shores, they found warriors painted in blue war paint, driving chariots in combat styles Rome had not seen for centuries. The terrain proved treacherous, with dense forests and marshlands that swallowed entire units. Yet Caesar's forces adapted, using their superior discipline and engineering skills to establish footholds along the coast. The British tribes fought with desperate courage, knowing their homeland faced foreign invasion. They used guerrilla tactics, striking Roman patrols and vanishing into familiar countryside. Caesar found himself fighting an enemy that refused conventional battle, preferring hit-and-run attacks that tested Roman patience and resources. Still, his legions pressed forward, building fortified camps and establishing supply lines across the Channel. Caesar's second British expedition in 54 BC proved more successful. This time, he brought larger forces and better equipment, having learned from earlier mistakes. His engineers constructed improved ships designed specifically for channel crossings. The psychological impact of these expeditions reached far beyond their immediate military results. News of Caesar crossing the ocean to fight unknown enemies spread throughout the Mediterranean world. Back in Rome, Caesar's British adventures captured public imagination like nothing before. Citizens gathered in forums to hear tales of their general battling painted warriors across mysterious seas. Poets composed verses about Roman eagles planted on distant shores. Political rivals watched nervously as Caesar's reputation grew beyond their ability to challenge or match. These expeditions served Caesar's larger strategy perfectly. Each impossible feat he accomplished made him seem more legendary, more indispensable to Rome's glory. His soldiers developed absolute faith in their commander's abilities, knowing he would lead them to victory regardless of obstacles. Enemy tribes throughout Gaul began to see Roman power as unstoppable, their general as something approaching divine. Yet these successes also deepened fears among Rome's elite. Caesar's growing legend threatened the established order, making traditional politicians appear small and ordinary by comparison. His next great challenge would come not from distant barbarians, but from a united Gallic uprising that would test everything he had built during years of conquest. Part 4. I came, I saw, I conquered. The defeat of Vercingetorix. The rebellion started like wildfire across Gaul in 52 BC. After years of watching their neighbors fall to Roman legions, the tribes finally found their voice in a young Arverni chieftain named Vercingetorix. He possessed something most Gallic leaders lacked, the ability to unite quarreling tribes under one banner. His message was simple yet powerful: drive out the Romans or lose everything forever. Caesar found himself facing an entirely different kind of war. Gone were the days of fighting scattered tribes one by one. Now he confronted a coordinated enemy that had learned from Roman tactics, adopted Roman discipline, and possessed intimate knowledge of their own terrain. Vercingetorix proved himself a brilliant strategist, avoiding direct confrontation while striking at Roman supply lines and isolated garrisons. The Gallic leader's greatest strength lay in his understanding of Roman weaknesses. He knew Caesar's army needed constant supplies and reinforcements from friendly territory. By cutting these lifelines and employing scorched earth tactics, Vercingetorix forced the Romans into increasingly desperate situations. His forces would strike quickly, then melt away into forests and hills the Romans barely knew. Caesar recognized the mortal threat this presented. His political enemies in Rome were already questioning his extended campaigns, and a major defeat would destroy both his military reputation and political future. He needed a decisive victory, not just another tactical success. The fate of his entire career hung in the balance. The confrontation came at Alesia, a hilltop fortress where Vercingetorix chose to make his stand. The Gallic leader believed the strong position would force Caesar into a costly siege, while Gallic reinforcements gathered from across the land. What followed became one of history's most remarkable displays of military engineering and tactical brilliance. Caesar surrounded Alesia with a massive wall, trapping the defenders inside. But knowing relief armies would come, he built a second wall facing outward, protecting his own forces from attack. His legions found themselves simultaneously besieging a fortress and preparing for siege themselves. The Romans worked day and night, creating an intricate system of fortifications that turned the landscape into a death trap. When the Gallic relief army arrived, numbering perhaps 60,000 warriors, they found themselves caught between Caesar's walls and the fortress they came to save. The battle that followed saw Roman discipline triumph over Gallic courage. Attacked from multiple directions, Caesar himself led a cavalry charge that broke the relief force completely. Vercingetorix watched his last hope disappear from Alesia's walls. In a final act of nobility, he surrendered himself to save his starving followers. The proud chieftain rode out alone, threw down his weapons at Caesar's feet, and accepted captivity. With their leader's surrender, organized resistance in Gaul collapsed. This victory transformed Caesar from successful general to legendary conqueror. He had not merely defeated enemies, he had added an entire region larger than Italy to Roman control. The wealth and prestige flowing from this triumph made him the most powerful man in Rome's world. Yet this very success set him on a collision course with those who feared his growing strength, particularly Pompey, who now saw his former ally as an existential threat to his own position. Part 5. A rivalry strained. The unraveling bond with Pompey. The news of Caesar's victory at Alesia reached Rome like a thunderbolt. While citizens celebrated another triumph for the Republic, Pompey Magnus felt each cheer like a knife to his reputation. For decades, he had been Rome's greatest general, the man who conquered the East and brought unimaginable wealth home. Now Caesar's name was on every tongue, his victories making Pompey's past glories seem distant memories. The partnership between these two titans had always been fragile, built on mutual benefit rather than friendship. Caesar needed Pompey's political influence to secure his consulship and Gallic command. Pompey needed Caesar's popularity and Crassus's wealth to maintain his power. But with Crassus dead in the Syrian desert and Caesar's star rising, the balance that held their alliance together began to crumble. Pompey watched Caesar's growing influence with mounting alarm. Each Gallic victory brought Caesar closer to matching Pompey's own achievements. The gold flowing from conquered territories funded Caesar's ambitions and bought loyalty among Rome's citizens. Worse still, Caesar's legions had become fanatically devoted to their commander, seeing him as their path to wealth and glory. The Senate, longtime enemies of both men, saw opportunity in this growing tension. Conservative senators like Cato whispered poison in Pompey's ear, reminding him that Caesar's return would eclipse his own legacy forever. They painted pictures of Caesar as a new king, a destroyer of republican traditions. Slowly, they convinced Pompey that his former ally represented everything wrong with Rome's direction. Caesar sensed the shift from distant Gaul. Letters from friends warned him that Pompey was distancing himself, making speeches about protecting the Republic from ambitious generals. The irony was bitter. Pompey, who had marched on Rome himself, now positioned himself as the defender of constitutional order. Caesar knew his enemies were working to turn his greatest ally into his most dangerous opponent. The breaking point came when Caesar requested permission to run for consul while remaining in Gaul with his armies. This would allow him to return to Rome with legal protection from prosecution. Pompey, urged by the Senate, refused. Instead, he demanded Caesar dismiss his legions and return as a private citizen, vulnerable to his enemies' revenge. Both men understood what this meant. Caesar could not survive politically without his army's protection. Pompey could not allow Caesar to keep those same armies without losing his own supremacy. The republic that had made both men great was now too small to contain them both. As winter settled over Gaul in 50 BC, Caesar faced an impossible choice: surrender his command and face destruction by his enemies, or march south with his legions and challenge the man who had once been his partner. The friendship between Rome's two greatest generals was dead, killed by ambition, fear, and the machinations of lesser men who would profit from their conflict. Chapter 3. The Breaking Point. Civil War and the Rubicon. Part 1. The Senate's Ultimatum, a choice between humility and war. The tension in Rome reached a breaking point as winter settled over the city in 49 BC. Behind closed doors, senators whispered urgently about what to do with Julius Caesar, their most successful general who had spent nearly a decade conquering Gaul. His victories had brought immense wealth and glory to Rome, but they had also made him dangerously powerful. Pompey the Great, once Caesar's ally and son-in-law, now stood firmly against him. The marriage bond between their families had dissolved with Julia's death, and political friendship had withered into bitter rivalry. Pompey convinced himself and others that Caesar posed a threat to the Republic itself. The Senate chamber buzzed with fear and ambition, as conservative senators like Cato rallied around Pompey's growing influence. The ultimatum came with all the weight of Roman tradition behind it. The Senate demanded that Caesar disband his armies immediately and return to Rome as an ordinary citizen. No legions, no bodyguards, no protection. He would face his enemies in the courts, where his political rivals waited eagerly to destroy him with lawsuits and accusations. For any other Roman, this might have been acceptable. For Caesar, it meant political suicide. Caesar understood the trap perfectly. Without his military command, he would lose his legal immunity. His enemies would drag him through endless trials, strip away his wealth, and likely send him into exile. Everything he had built through years of brilliant campaigning would crumble. His soldiers, who had followed him through the forests of Germany and across the rivers of Gaul, would be left without their promised rewards. Yet defying the Senate meant something far worse than personal ruin. It meant civil war. Roman blood would flow as legions that once fought side by side would turn their weapons on each other. The republic that had endured for centuries would tear itself apart. Caesar knew that crossing this line would brand him forever as either Rome's savior or its destroyer. The constitutional crisis cut to the heart of Roman government. Could the Senate force a popular general to surrender his power? Did Caesar's military achievements give him the right to challenge traditional authority? These questions had no clear answers in Roman law, leaving both sides to interpret ancient customs in ways that served their immediate needs. As messengers raced back and forth between Rome and Caesar's winter quarters in Gaul, the stakes became crystal clear. This was no longer about legal procedures or constitutional precedent. It was about the future of Rome itself. Would the old aristocratic system survive, or would military power reshape the Republic forever? Caesar faced the most crucial decision of his life, knowing that whatever choice he made would echo through history. The die was about to be cast. Part 2. Crossing the Rubicon. Defiance that shook a republic. The moment Caesar received the Senate's ultimatum, he gathered his most trusted officers at his headquarters in Ravenna. The winter winds howled outside as he paced the wooden floors, weighing options that would determine not just his fate, but Rome's future. His loyal 13th Legion waited nearby, veterans who had followed him through 8 years of brutal campaigns in Gaul. These men had shed blood for their commander and expected him to protect their interests when they returned home. Caesar knew the Senate's demand was a trap. If he disbanded his army and returned to Rome as a private citizen, his enemies would immediately drag him through the courts on trumped-up charges. Without the immunity his position provided, he would face exile or death. His political career would end in disgrace, and the veterans who had served him faithfully would lose their promised land grants and retirement benefits. Yet crossing the Rubicon River with armed forces meant declaring war on the Roman state itself. This small waterway marked the boundary between Gaul and Italy proper. Roman law strictly forbade any general from bringing troops across this line without Senate permission. The act would brand Caesar a traitor and enemy of Rome, making reconciliation impossible. For 3 days, Caesar wrestled with the decision. His advisors presented arguments on both sides, but the choice ultimately rested with him alone. Some urged caution, reminding him of previous generals who had challenged Rome and failed. Others pointed out that his enemies would never allow him to live peacefully in retirement. They had pushed him into this corner deliberately, believing he would back down when faced with such dire consequences. On a cold January morning in 49 BC, Caesar made his choice. He ordered the 13th Legion to break camp and march toward the Rubicon. As they approached the river, Caesar himself rode ahead to the muddy banks. The water looked ordinary enough, hardly impressive for such a famous boundary. Yet everyone understood the weight of what was about to happen. Caesar paused at the water's edge, knowing that once he crossed, there could be no turning back. According to the historian Suetonius, he spoke the famous words, "Alea iacta est," the die is cast. With that declaration, he spurred his horse into the shallow water, his legion following behind. The splash of thousands of boots in the Rubicon created ripples that would spread across the ancient world. In that moment, the Roman Republic entered its final crisis. Caesar had chosen war over submission, gambling everything on his ability to defeat the combined forces of the Senate and Pompey. The political rivalry that had simmered for years now burst into open conflict that would consume Rome for the next 5 years and reshape the Mediterranean world forever. Part 3. March on Rome, Battle Lines, Betrayals, and Pompey's Fall. Caesar's army swept through Italy like a spring flood racing down mountain slopes. Town after town opened their gates without a fight. The soldiers who were supposed to defend against him instead threw down their weapons and joined his ranks. Within weeks, Caesar had transformed from an outlaw general into the master of most of Italy. Pompey watched this disaster unfold from Rome with growing horror. The man once called the Great found himself scrambling to salvage a situation that had collapsed faster than anyone imagined possible. His carefully laid plans crumbled as Caesar's popularity with common soldiers and citizens became impossible to ignore. Where Pompey expected fierce resistance, he found only enthusiastic welcome for his rival. The speed of Caesar's advance caught everyone off guard. His legions moved with practiced efficiency, covering ground that should have taken months in mere weeks. Caesar himself seemed to be everywhere at once, appearing at the gates of cities before their defenders even knew he was coming. This wasn't just military skill, it was psychological warfare at its finest. Faced with Caesar's unstoppable momentum, Pompey made a decision that shocked Rome. Rather than stand and fight in Italy, he abandoned the capital and fled to Greece. His reasoning was sound. Greece would give him time to gather his eastern allies and build a massive army. But to ordinary Romans, it looked like their greatest general was running away. The Senate followed Pompey in his retreat, taking with them the treasury and the symbols of legitimate government. Rome itself fell to Caesar without a single battle. Citizens lined the streets to cheer as he entered the city that had tried to destroy him just months before. Caesar's clemency policy proved as effective as his military tactics. Instead of executing captured enemies, he pardoned them and often welcomed them into his own ranks. This unexpected mercy won him supporters who had expected brutal revenge. Even some of Pompey's closest allies began to question whether they had chosen the right side. The war that followed played out across the Mediterranean. Caesar chased Pompey's forces from Spain to Greece, winning victory after victory. At each triumph, more of Pompey's supporters switched sides or simply gave up the fight. The great alliance that was supposed to crush Caesar dissolved like salt in water. Pompey's final defeat came not in a grand battle, but through betrayal in Egypt. Seeking refuge after his loss at Pharsalus, he was murdered by men who thought Caesar would reward them for eliminating his rival. Instead, Caesar wept when presented with Pompey's head, genuinely grieved by the death of his former ally. With Pompey's death, organized resistance to Caesar effectively ended. The Roman Republic's last defenders had been scattered or silenced. Caesar now stood alone at the peak of Roman power, facing the challenge of rebuilding a world he had helped tear apart. Part 4. Cleopatra and the Nile, the Egyptian Gambit. Caesar's arrival in Egypt brought him face to face with a kingdom in turmoil. The young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII had driven his sister and co-ruler Cleopatra VII from Alexandria, forcing her into exile. What began as Caesar's pursuit of Pompey's killers quickly transformed into something far more significant. Cleopatra understood that Caesar represented her best hope of reclaiming her throne. She needed to reach him before her brother's advisors could poison his mind against her. Legend tells of her being smuggled into Caesar's quarters wrapped in a carpet, but the reality was likely more mundane. What mattered was not how she arrived, but what happened when she did. The Egyptian queen was 21 years old, brilliant, and spoke 9 languages fluently. She had ruled Egypt since she was 18, navigating the deadly waters of Ptolemaic court politics. Caesar, now 52, found himself captivated not just by her beauty, but by her sharp intellect and political acumen. Their alliance began as pure political calculation. Caesar needed Egypt's vast wealth to fund his wars and secure grain supplies for Rome. Cleopatra needed Roman military support to defeat her brother and secure her reign. But personal attraction quickly complicated their arrangement. Within months, Cleopatra was pregnant with Caesar's child. The brief Alexandrian War that followed showed Caesar's military genius in new circumstances. Fighting in the narrow streets of Alexandria, he faced Egyptian forces familiar with their own terrain. His men struggled against guerrilla tactics and local knowledge. When Egyptian forces set fire to ships in the harbor, the flames spread to part of the famous Library of Alexandria, destroying irreplaceable scrolls. Caesar's victory came through tactical innovation and overwhelming force. He brought Cleopatra back to power, but not without cost. Roman soldiers had died far from home for what many saw as a foreign queen's ambition. Critics in Rome whispered that their commander had been seduced by Eastern luxury and forgotten his Roman duty. The political consequences reached far beyond Egypt's borders. Caesar's relationship with Cleopatra signaled his vision of Rome as the center of a Mediterranean empire, not merely an Italian republic. He brought Egyptian astronomers to Rome, adopted their calendar reforms, and displayed Cleopatra's gifts in Roman temples. Their son Caesarion represented something entirely new in Roman politics. Here was a potential heir who embodied both Roman power and Eastern royalty. Conservative Romans viewed this mixing of bloodlines with horror, seeing it as the first step toward the kind of divine monarchy they had overthrown centuries earlier. Caesar's months in Egypt revealed his broader ambitions. He was no longer simply a Roman general conquering territory for the Republic. He had become something unprecedented, a Roman leader building personal alliances with foreign rulers, creating a network of power that transcended traditional Roman boundaries. When Caesar finally left Egypt, he carried with him not just military victory, but a transformed vision of his own destiny. The boy from the Suburra now saw himself as ruler of the entire Mediterranean world, with Cleopatra as his Eastern partner in this grand design. Part 5. The World's Conqueror, From Zella to Dictatorship. From Egypt, Caesar swept eastward to deal with a troublesome king named Pharnaces. This ruler had seized Roman territory while Caesar was busy elsewhere, thinking the great general was too distracted to respond. Pharnaces had gravely miscalculated. At Zela in 47 BC, Caesar's veterans met Pharnaces in battle. The fighting lasted barely 4 hours. Caesar's experienced legions crushed the enemy so completely that the victory became legendary. It was here that Caesar penned his famous message to the Senate, Veni Vidi Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. These 3 simple words captured not just military efficiency, but Caesar's growing confidence in his own unstoppable power. Word of Caesar's swift victories traveled faster than his army. Each triumph added to his reputation as an invincible commander. Romans began to whisper that Caesar possessed divine favor, that the gods themselves fought beside him. This was exactly the kind of talk that made senators back in Rome increasingly nervous. When Caesar finally returned to Rome in 46 BC, the city had never seen anything like his triumph. 4 separate victory parades stretched across days, displaying treasures from Gaul, Egypt, and his recent eastern campaigns. Captured kings walked in chains while wagons groaned under the weight of gold and silver. The crowds cheered wildly as Caesar rode his chariot through streets lined with spoils from across the known world. But it was Caesar's new title that truly alarmed the old guard. He had been named dictator, initially for a limited term to handle specific crises. Yet as months passed, Caesar showed no intention of stepping down. He began accepting honors that no Roman had ever held: the right to wear a golden wreath at all times, a throne in the Senate house, and ceremonies that resembled the worship of Eastern kings. Caesar's reforms came in rapid succession. He restructured debt laws to help struggling citizens, expanded citizenship to people in distant provinces, and launched massive public works projects that employed thousands. Many Romans loved these changes, but senators watched with growing alarm as Caesar bypassed their authority entirely. The dictator's personal behavior fed their fears. He had brought Cleopatra to Rome, installing her in a villa across the river with their infant son. This Egyptian queen attended public ceremonies as if she were Caesar's royal consort. To conservative Romans, this looked dangerously like the creation of a dynasty, complete with foreign influences they despised. By 44 BC, Caesar held power that dwarfed any previous Roman leader. He controlled the armies, the treasury, and the law courts. His statues appeared in temples alongside the gods. When flatterers suggested he accept the title of king, Caesar's public refusals seemed increasingly hollow. The senators who had once opposed him now faced a stark reality. The republic they had known was disappearing, replaced by the personal rule of one man whose ambitions seemed to know no bounds. Their worst fears about Caesar's monarchical intentions were becoming undeniable truths, setting the stage for the conspiracy that would soon shake Rome to its foundations. Chapter 4: Reforms and Resistance, Dictatorship and Discontent. Part 1: Rebuilding Rome. New laws, new calendar, new order. When Caesar returned to Rome as dictator, he found a city drowning in chaos. The streets overflowed with unemployed veterans and displaced farmers. Government offices ran on bribery and old favors. The calendar itself had fallen apart, with months drifting far from their proper seasons, because priests had been adding extra days for political gain rather than astronomical accuracy. Caesar rolled up his sleeves and went to work. He gathered the best minds he could find, including Greek astronomers and Egyptian scholars who understood how time actually moved through the heavens. Together they created what would become the Julian calendar. This new system followed the sun's path more closely, giving Rome 365 days each year with an extra day every fourth year. To fix the mess left by the old system, Caesar had to create one incredibly long year of 445 days in 46 BC, which Romans jokingly called the Year of Confusion. But Caesar's reforms reached far beyond timekeeping. He restructured how Rome's provinces were governed, sending honest administrators to replace corrupt officials who had been bleeding the territories dry. He standardized weights and measures across the empire so merchants could trade fairly. New public works projects put thousands of Romans back to work, building roads, temples, and expanding the Forum. The dictator tackled Rome's massive debt crisis by forcing creditors to accept property as payment at pre-war values. This saved countless families from ruin while preventing a complete economic collapse. He established colonies for his veterans in places like Carthage and Corinth, giving them land and purpose while spreading Roman culture throughout the Mediterranean. Caesar also streamlined the bloated Roman bureaucracy. Government positions that had multiplied over the years were cut back to manageable numbers. He increased the size of the Senate from 600 to 900 members, filling the new seats with capable men from across the empire rather than just old Roman families. This move horrified traditional senators, who saw their exclusive club being diluted with outsiders. These changes worked with stunning efficiency. Trade flowed more smoothly, courts operated more fairly, and ordinary Romans could see their government actually functioning. The new calendar helped farmers plan their crops and merchants schedule their voyages. Cities across the empire began following Roman legal standards, creating a sense of shared civilization. Yet every reform came with a cost. Each improvement Caesar made required him to override traditional Roman customs and senatorial privilege. The old families watched their ancient powers being redistributed to newcomers and provincials. What Caesar saw as necessary modernization, they viewed as dangerous revolution. The speed and scope of these changes left many Romans breathless. In just 2 years, Caesar had transformed systems that had developed over centuries. His efficiency proved his capability, but it also demonstrated just how much power one man could wield when traditional restraints no longer applied. Part 2: Expanding Citizenship, Caesar's Vision for Unity. Caesar's most daring reforms struck at the heart of what it meant to be Roman. For centuries, Roman citizenship had been a precious privilege, carefully guarded by the old families who traced their bloodlines back to the city's founders. But Caesar saw something different when he looked across his vast territories. He saw Gauls who had fought beside his legions, Spanish merchants who fed Rome's economy, and provincial leaders who governed their regions with skill and loyalty. The decision came naturally from his experiences. During his Gallic campaigns, Caesar had watched foreign warriors die for Rome with the same courage as any citizen soldier. He had seen provincial administrators manage complex problems that would challenge the most experienced Roman senator. These people served Rome faithfully, yet they remained outsiders looking in at the privileges of true citizenship. Caesar began extending Roman citizenship to entire communities across Gaul and Spain. Suddenly, tribal leaders who had once fought Rome became Roman citizens with full legal rights. Merchants in distant provinces could now appeal to Roman courts and participate in Roman business on equal terms. Soldiers who had served in Caesar's armies found themselves welcomed into the Roman family they had helped defend. The practical benefits were immediate and obvious. Newly minted citizens felt genuine loyalty to Rome rather than mere submission. They invested in Roman culture, adopted Roman customs, and raised their children to see themselves as Romans. Tax collection became easier when provincial leaders felt they had a stake in Rome's success. Military recruitment expanded as citizenship became a reward rather than a distant dream. But in Rome itself, the old elite watched these changes with growing horror. Senators whose families had held citizenship for generations suddenly found themselves sharing forums and temples with former enemies. The exclusive clubs and sacred rituals that had defined Roman identity now welcomed men who spoke Latin with foreign accents and worshipped gods with unpronounceable names. Marcus Cato and his allies complained bitterly that Caesar was destroying everything that made Rome special. They argued that citizenship meant nothing if it could be handed out like grain rations. The sacred bond between citizen and state, they claimed, was being cheapened by Caesar's political calculations. Yet Caesar pushed forward with characteristic determination. He understood that Rome's future lay not in preserving the narrow privileges of a few hundred families, but in creating a unified empire where talent and loyalty mattered more than ancestry. His vision imagined a Rome where a Gallic chieftain's son could become a senator, where Spanish merchants could influence policy, where the empire's strength came from diversity rather than exclusion. The speed of these changes left traditional Romans reeling. Within months, the composition of Roman society had shifted dramatically. Caesar had not just changed laws, he had redefined what Rome itself could become. This transformation would prove irreversible, but it also deepened the fear among conservatives that their beloved republic was disappearing forever. The more Caesar expanded Rome's embrace, the more desperately his enemies plotted to stop him. Part 3. Enemies Within, the Senate Plots, and the Fear of Kingship. The transformation Caesar had unleashed across Rome sent shockwaves through the marble halls of the Senate. While citizens in distant provinces celebrated their new status, the old families of Rome watched in horror as their exclusive world crumbled around them. The Senate chamber, once filled with voices speaking Latin with pure Roman accents, now echoed with the varied tones of former foreigners debating the future of the empire. Marcus Porcius Cato the Younger had warned of this moment for years. From his seat in the Senate, he watched Gallic nobles take their places among men whose families had guided Rome for centuries. These newcomers spoke of gratitude to Caesar, of loyalty to the man who had elevated them. Cato saw something far more dangerous than mere politics. He witnessed the death of the Roman Republic itself. Brutus felt the weight of his ancestry pressing down on him every time he entered the Senate House. His ancestor had expelled the last king of Rome 5 centuries earlier, establishing the republic that now seemed to be slipping away. Friends whispered in his ear about Caesar's growing power, about the way senators now looked to one man for approval before speaking. The republic his family had helped create was becoming a monarchy in all but name. Cassius harbored deeper grievances. Caesar had passed him over for important positions, favoring men of lesser ability but greater loyalty. The sting of personal rejection mixed with genuine fear for Rome's future. In private conversations with other senators, Cassius painted vivid pictures of what Rome would become under permanent dictatorship. He spoke of eastern kingdoms where subjects prostrated themselves before kings, warning that Romans would soon kneel before Caesar. The conspirators met in houses throughout Rome, their conversations carefully guarded. They called themselves liberators, convinced they were saving the republic from tyranny. Each brought different motivations to their secret gatherings. Some acted from wounded pride, others from philosophical conviction, still others from family honor. What united them was fear that Caesar's reforms had gone too far, too fast. Caesar's supporters remained blind to the growing danger. They saw only the prosperity his policies brought, the stability his strong hand provided. When citizens praised Caesar's generosity or provincials spoke of their gratitude, his inner circle took these as signs of universal approval. They failed to notice the sullen silence of old Roman families or the way conversations stopped when Caesar's name was mentioned in certain circles. The conspiracy gained momentum as more senators joined their cause. Each new recruit brought fresh grievances against Caesar's rule. They shared stories of slights and oversights, of traditions trampled and customs ignored. What began as whispered complaints grew into organized resistance. The liberators convinced themselves that Rome would thank them for their courage, that the Republic would rise again once Caesar was removed. The stage was set for confrontation between two visions of Rome's future. Caesar's path led toward unified empire and expanded citizenship. The conspirators' path promised a return to traditional values and senatorial authority. Neither side could retreat from their position, and neither understood how completely they had misread the other's determination. Part 4. Dictator for Life. The Final Provocation. The conspirators' whispered meetings and careful planning suddenly gained urgent purpose when Caesar made his most provocative move yet. In February 44 BC, the Senate granted him the title of Dictator Perpetuo, Dictator for Life. This single appointment changed everything. Where previous dictators had served for 6 months during emergencies, Caesar now held unlimited power with no end date. The Roman Republic, which had survived for nearly 5 centuries, appeared to breathe its last breath. Caesar accepted this extraordinary honor with characteristic confidence. He may have believed it would bring stability to Rome, ending the cycle of civil wars that had torn the Republic apart. From his perspective, the appointment simply acknowledged what everyone already knew. He was the most powerful man in the world. Why pretend otherwise? His supporters argued that Rome needed strong leadership, not the endless debates and petty rivalries that had paralyzed the Senate for decades. But for his enemies, this appointment crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The title of king had been forbidden in Rome since the expulsion of Tarquin the Proud 500 years earlier. Now Caesar held power that exceeded any king's authority. He could make laws without Senate approval, appoint magistrates at will, and command all of Rome's armies indefinitely. The elaborate system of checks and balances that had defined the Republic meant nothing. Brutus felt the weight of his ancestry more heavily than ever. His ancestor had helped found the Republic by driving out the last king. Now he watched Caesar receive honors that made mockery of everything his family had stood for. Cassius grew more desperate with each passing day, knowing that Caesar's power would only increase with time. Other senators who had wavered now saw clearly that compromise was impossible. The appointment galvanized the conspiracy in ways that previous grievances had not. Caesar's earlier actions could be explained as temporary measures during troubled times. But Dictator for Life suggested permanence that terrified even moderate senators. They began to see the assassination not as murder but as tyrannicide, the killing of a tyrant to save the state. Caesar seemed unaware of how dramatically the mood had shifted. He continued his daily routines, attended Senate meetings, and planned new campaigns. His confidence had always served him well, but now it blinded him to the danger gathering around him. The man who had conquered Gaul and crossed the Rubicon could not see that his greatest battle would be fought not on distant battlefields, but in the heart of Rome itself. The conspirators now had their final justification. Caesar had declared himself Rome's permanent master, and they convinced themselves that history would remember them as liberators rather than assassins. Part 5. The Ides of March, Conspiracy and Assassination. The morning of March 15, 44 BC, began like any other in Rome. Caesar rose early in his villa, unaware that this day would end an era. His wife Calpurnia had suffered terrible nightmares the night before. She dreamed of their house collapsing and Caesar dying in her arms. When she woke, she begged her husband not to leave home. Caesar hesitated. He had always been superstitious, watching for omens and signs. A fortune teller had warned him weeks earlier to beware the Ides of March. Now his wife's fears seemed to confirm his growing unease. but duty called. The Senate was meeting to discuss his upcoming campaign against Parthia, and as dictator for life, his presence was expected. Meanwhile, across the city, 60 conspirators prepared for murder. Brutus, Caesar's adopted son, struggled with his conscience. He loved Caesar like a father, yet believed Rome's freedom demanded this sacrifice. Cassius, driven by jealousy and political ambition, had spent months convincing others to join their cause. They had chosen the theater of Pompey for their deed, as Senate meetings in Caesar's forum felt too much like worship. The conspirators arrived early, hiding daggers beneath their togas. Their hands trembled, but their resolve held firm. They positioned themselves around the chamber, each knowing his role. When Caesar entered, they would surround him under the pretense of presenting petitions. Then, at Cassius's signal, they would strike together. Caesar finally decided to attend the Senate meeting. As his litter carried him through Rome's streets, citizens called out greetings. He waved back, still the charming general who had won their hearts. At the theater entrance, someone pressed a scroll into his hands, warning of the plot, but Caesar, distracted by other matters, never read it. Inside the chamber, the conspirators' tension was visible. Several senators noticed their pale faces and nervous gestures. When Caesar took his golden chair, Tullius Cimber approached with a petition to recall his exiled brother. As planned, other conspirators crowded around, pressing closer under the guise of supporting the request. Caesar grew irritated by their persistence. "This is improper," he declared, rising from his chair. At that moment, Cimber grabbed Caesar's toga and pulled it from his shoulders. This was the signal. Casca struck first, his blade finding Caesar's neck. Caesar spun around in shock, blood flowing down his white robe. The attack became a frenzy. 23 wounds would mark Caesar's body, though later examination showed only one was fatal. Caesar fought back initially, using his stylus as a weapon, but when he saw Brutus among his attackers, his spirit broke. "Et tu, Brute?" he gasped. "Then fall, Caesar." He covered his face with his toga and fell at the base of Pompey's statue. The deed was done in minutes, but its consequences would last centuries. The conspirators stood frozen, covered in blood, suddenly realizing the magnitude of their action. They had killed the most powerful man in the world. But what came next? Rome would never be the same. Chapter 5. The Shadow in the Empire. Aftermath and Eternal Influence. Part 1. Rome in shock. The people and the power struggle. The blood still stained the marble steps of the theater of Pompey when word spread like wildfire through Rome's crowded streets. Caesar was dead. The man who had conquered Gaul, crossed the Rubicon, and become dictator for life had fallen to 23 stab wounds from his own senators. In the hours that followed, Rome trembled with uncertainty. The conspirators had planned the murder carefully, but they had no clear plan for what came next. Brutus, the noble descendant of the Republic's founder, believed Romans would celebrate their freedom from tyranny. He was wrong. As news reached the common people, shock turned to grief, then to anger. Caesar had been their champion, the man who gave them bread, games, and glory. Many wept openly in the streets. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal lieutenant and co-consul, had narrowly escaped death himself. Warned by a note from his wife, he had fled the Senate meeting disguised as a slave. Now he faced a terrible choice. The assassins controlled the Senate House and held the high ground of Republican tradition. But Caesar's veterans filled the city and his fortune remained untouched. The conspirators made their first crucial mistake. Instead of seizing Caesar's wealth and papers immediately, they allowed Antony to retrieve them. Inside Caesar's house, Antony found the dictator's will, his private correspondence, and most importantly, his massive treasury. Caesar had left gardens and money to every Roman citizen. This generous bequest would soon turn public opinion decisively against the murderers. 3 days after the assassination, Antony stood before a crowd in the Forum to deliver Caesar's funeral oration. He spoke carefully at first, acknowledging the conspirators as honorable men, while listing Caesar's achievements. Then he held up the bloody toga, pointing to each tear made by the assassins' daggers. The crowd erupted. Grief became rage, and rage became violence. Mobs surged through the streets, hunting for anyone connected to the conspiracy. They found the poet Cinna and tore him apart, mistaking him for the conspirator of the same name. Houses burned as Romans demanded vengeance for their fallen leader. Brutus and Cassius, the assassination's leaders, fled the city in terror. But Caesar's death had created more than just public chaos. It had shattered the delicate balance that kept Rome's powerful families in check. Without the dictator's overwhelming presence, every ambitious man began calculating his chances for supreme power. Antony controlled Caesar's soldiers and money. The conspirators held moral authority among traditional Republicans. And somewhere in the provinces, Caesar's 18-year-old adopted son Octavian was racing toward Rome with dangerous ambitions of his own. The Republic's wounds had been masked by Caesar's strong hand. Now, with that hand gone, the bleeding began in earnest. The streets of Rome would soon echo with the march of armies as former allies became bitter enemies, fighting over the bones of a dying political system. Part 2. The Rise of Octavian, Mark Antony, Civil War, and the End of the Republic. Octavian arrived in Rome like a storm cloud gathering strength. At just 18 years old, Caesar's adopted son possessed something his rivals lacked: the magic of Caesar's name. The young man had been studying in Greece when news of the assassination reached him. While others hesitated, Octavian acted with startling speed and confidence. The power struggle that followed divided Rome into warring camps. Mark Antony commanded Caesar's veteran soldiers and controlled the treasury. Brutus and Cassius held the moral high ground among traditional senators. But Octavian brought something different to the table. He carried Caesar's will, which named him as heir and left generous gifts to every Roman citizen. More importantly, he understood the power of symbols and public opinion. The first alliance seemed natural. Octavian joined forces with Mark Antony and another general named Lepidus to form what historians call the Second Triumvirate. Together, they hunted down Caesar's assassins with ruthless efficiency. Brutus and Cassius fled to the eastern provinces, where they raised armies of their own. The Republic was tearing itself apart as Roman fought Roman across the Mediterranean world. At Philippi in 42 BC, the triumvirs crushed the last Republican forces. Brutus and Cassius both died on the battlefield, ending the dream of restoring the old Senate's power. But victory only created new problems. With their common enemies dead, the triumvirs began eyeing each other suspiciously. Lepidus proved weak and was pushed aside. The real contest lay between Antony and Octavian. Antony controlled the wealthy eastern provinces and fell under the spell of Egypt's queen, Cleopatra. Their romance became a political partnership that threatened Rome's western territories. Octavian skillfully painted this relationship as a betrayal of Roman values. He portrayed Antony as a man seduced by foreign luxury and eastern decadence. The final confrontation came at Actium in 31 BC. Octavian's fleet, commanded by his brilliant admiral Agrippa, faced Antony and Cleopatra's combined forces in the waters off western Greece. The battle was less dramatic than decisive. Cleopatra's ships fled early, and Antony followed her, abandoning his remaining forces. Within a year, both lovers were dead by suicide in Alexandria. Octavian returned to Rome as the undisputed master of the Roman world. But he had learned from Caesar's mistake. Instead of declaring himself dictator, he carefully preserved the appearance of republican government while concentrating real power in his own hands. The Senate still met, consuls were still elected, but everyone understood who truly ruled. In 27 BC, the Senate granted him the title Augustus, meaning revered one. The Roman Republic was finished, though few dared say so openly. Augustus had created something entirely new, an empire that would endure for centuries, built on the foundation of Caesar's ambitions and watered with the blood of civil war. Part 3. From Republic to Empire, Augustus and the Birth of a New Age. Augustus understood power better than any man of his generation. He had watched Caesar rise to greatness, only to fall to assassins' daggers. He had seen Mark Antony's strength crumble in the face of careful political maneuvering. Now, standing as Rome's undisputed ruler after Actium, he faced a choice that would shape the next 5 centuries of human history. The young emperor knew that Romans still cherished their republic's memory. Senators whispered about liberty in marble halls. Citizens remembered when their votes mattered. The very word king made Roman blood boil. Augustus could have crushed these feelings with his legions, but he chose a more clever path. Instead of destroying republican traditions, he became their guardian. the Senate continued to meet in solemn session. Consuls still took office each year with grand ceremony. Citizens voted in elections that appeared meaningful. But beneath this familiar surface, everything had changed. Augustus held the real power through a web of titles and positions that seemed modest but carried enormous authority. He called himself first citizen rather than emperor. He accepted the consulship when offered, then stepped aside to show his humility. Yet his control over Rome's armies remained absolute. His influence over the Senate was complete. When senators debated, they watched his face for signs of approval or displeasure. When they voted, they remembered who commanded 30 legions. This careful balance worked because Augustus never forgot the lessons of Caesar's death. He honored the republic's forms while building an empire's substance. Roman citizens could tell themselves they lived in freedom while enjoying the peace and prosperity that strong leadership brought. The civil wars ended. Trade flourished, roads stretched across continents. The Mediterranean became a Roman lake. Augustus lived for 45 years after Actium, longer than most Romans dared hope. During this time, he carefully shaped the system that would survive him. He adopted heirs and trained them in statecraft. He created new offices for managing the vast territories under Roman control. He established the Praetorian Guard to protect future emperors. Most importantly, he made imperial rule seem natural and necessary. When Augustus died in AD 14, few Romans remembered what their republic had actually been like. His stepson Tiberius took power smoothly, following procedures Augustus had established. The Senate dutifully declared the dead emperor a god. Citizens mourned the man who had given them peace after decades of war. The transformation was complete. Rome had become an empire in everything but name, ruled by emperors who called themselves servants of the people. This system would endure through countless crises, producing both wise rulers and mad tyrants, but never returning to the old republican ways. Augustus had built something that outlasted even his own dynasty, creating the template for absolute power, disguised as public service, that would influence rulers for millennia to come. Part 4. Caesar's Living Legacy: the Calendar, Law, and Imperial Model. While Augustus consolidated power behind republican facades, the practical changes Caesar had set in motion transformed daily life across the Roman world in ways that would outlast any dynasty. The most visible of these changes appeared each time someone checked the date. Caesar's calendar reform, designed to fix the chaotic Roman system that had drifted wildly out of sync with the seasons, created a structure so logical that it survived nearly intact for over 15 centuries. The Julian calendar brought order to what had been administrative chaos. Before Caesar, Roman officials could manipulate time itself by adding or removing days to serve political purposes. A magistrate could extend his term by lengthening the year, or rush an election by shortening it. Caesar's astronomers created a system based on actual solar observation rather than political convenience. They established the 365-day year, with an extra day every fourth year, creating the leap year system we still use today. This calendar became the backbone of imperial administration. Tax collection, military campaigns, and legal proceedings all followed Caesar's time structure. When the Roman Empire expanded, the Julian calendar spread with it. Christian monks preserved and refined the system through medieval centuries. Even when Pope Gregory XIII made minor adjustments in 1582, he built upon Caesar's foundation rather than replacing it. Caesar's legal reforms proved equally enduring. He codified Roman law in ways that made it accessible and consistent across the vast territories Rome controlled. His principle that written law should be public and understandable became fundamental to Western legal tradition. The idea that citizens deserved to know the rules governing them, rather than relying on aristocratic interpretation of ancient customs, revolutionized how societies approached justice. Roman law, shaped by Caesar's reforms, provided the framework for legal systems across Europe and beyond. Concepts like the presumption of innocence, the right to legal representation, and the importance of written contracts all trace back to principles Caesar helped establish. Modern legal codes from France to Latin America still reflect structures Caesar put in place over 2,000 years ago. Perhaps most significantly, Caesar created the template for how absolute power could function within seemingly democratic institutions. Augustus perfected this model, but Caesar invented it. The idea that a single leader could claim popular mandate while maintaining traditional governmental forms became the standard playbook for ambitious rulers throughout history. This imperial model influenced everyone from Charlemagne to Napoleon, from British monarchs to American presidents. The tension between concentrated executive power and representative institutions that Caesar first explored continues to shape political debates today. His example showed how charismatic leadership could transform entire civilizations while claiming to preserve their cherished traditions. Caesar's reforms created practical systems that proved more durable than any monument. Every time we check our calendar, appeal to written law, or debate executive authority, we engage with innovations Caesar pioneered. His true conquest was not of territories, but of time, law, and political imagination itself. Part 5. Caesar in the World's Memory, From Ancient Inspiration to Modern Myth. Within decades of his death, Julius Caesar had already begun his transformation from mortal ruler to eternal symbol. Roman writers started crafting the legend that would outlast the empire itself. Plutarch painted him as a complex figure torn between greatness and ambition. Suetonius collected gossip and facts alike, creating a portrait both magnificent and flawed. These early accounts set the foundation for every story that would follow. The medieval world saw Caesar through different eyes. Kings and emperors claimed his legacy, using his name to justify their own power. The title Caesar became synonymous with absolute authority. Charlemagne crowned himself as heir to Roman glory. Medieval chronicles transformed him into a knight-like figure, complete with chivalrous virtues that the historical Caesar never possessed. Christian writers wrestled with his legacy, sometimes praising his order while condemning his ambition. When Shakespeare picked up his pen in Elizabethan England, he created the Caesar most people recognize today. The playwright focused on the moral drama of power and betrayal. His Caesar became the archetypal ambitious ruler whose fall serves as both warning and tragedy. The famous line, "Et tu, Brute," captured the personal anguish of ultimate betrayal, though Caesar likely never spoke those words. Shakespeare's version emphasized the human cost of political violence and the chaos that follows when great leaders fall. The Enlightenment thinkers found different lessons in Caesar's story. Voltaire admired his intellectual achievements and religious tolerance. Edward Gibbon saw him as both the creator and destroyer of Roman greatness. American founding fathers studied his career carefully, designing their new republic specifically to prevent another Caesar from emerging. They feared concentrated power while admiring his effectiveness. This tension between admiration and caution runs through democratic thinking ever since. Napoleon consciously modeled himself on Caesar, even commissioning artworks that drew direct parallels. He studied Caesar's campaigns, adopted similar strategies, and claimed to complete what Caesar had started. Other leaders followed this pattern. Mussolini plastered Rome with imperial imagery. Modern dictators still invoke Caesar's example to justify their actions. The comparison has become shorthand for the transformation from protector to tyrant. Popular culture keeps reinventing Caesar for new audiences. Hollywood films portray him as everything from wise statesman to power-hungry villain. Historical novels explore his private thoughts and motivations. Video games let players command his legions or plot his downfall. Each generation finds new meanings in his story, projecting contemporary concerns onto ancient events. What makes Caesar's memory so persistent is not just his historical importance, but his embodiment of universal human struggles. He represents the seductive power of ambition and the price of success. His story asks eternal questions about leadership, loyalty, and the cost of change. Every society grapples with the balance between order and freedom that Caesar's career dramatized. Today, we still invoke his name when discussing executive power, political ambition, and the fragility of democratic institutions. Caesar's ghost haunts every debate about strong leadership versus constitutional limits. His legend survives because it captures timeless truths about power, human nature, and the complex relationship between great individuals and the societies they transform.